Hi, everybody. If you were looking at the schedule, you saw this person named Mona Diab, who is awesome and wonderful, and unfortunately can't be here, so you have a bad replacement, which is me, who will be attempting to moderate this panel in her stead. But I do get to at least hang out with 3 of my friends, and so that feels like a win-win for me. So today this section is about red teaming in industry, and so we have 3 representatives from very different scales and types of companies who will be discussing these things, and we're going to go in reverse alphabetical order by last name just to make it complicated. So we're going to start off with you can see they're figuring it out too live. So we're going to start off with Meg Mitchell, who is a computer scientist who works on algorithmic bias and fairness in machine learning, most well known for her work on automatically removing undesired biases concerning demographic groups from machine learning models, as well as more transparent reporting of their intended use. And I would also just sort of note is just one of those people who we all kind of just know in the field as having like useful opinions. And so it's nice to have her, and she'll start us off. Thank you.
Thank you. Cool. That's a super sweet introduction, and I'm glad you're here too. Cool. So I'm here to talk a bit about red teaming from the Hugging Face perspective. I think before I start, I should say that we've all sort of hit a consensus where we don't feel like red teaming is necessarily the top priority. And so this is a bit educational, just kind of level setting on where Hugging Face is at in terms of our understanding and what we're thinking about, but we're not necessarily advocating for red teaming as one of the best solutions for handling problematic outcomes of technology. Okay, so first a little bit about Hugging Face. It's a community-oriented company. We aim to be open source and open science. And this might come up in the discussion later, but it's not just open source. We talk about open science, which speaks to a gradient of openness, where you can have different levels of things being closed. The goal is to have a platform where people can develop good machine learning, to empower and incentivize good machine learning, and make it available with lowered barriers to access, so that as many people as possible can learn about these systems from different angles based on the developers' desires with the safety of the systems. We work on hosting machine learning models and data sets. We provide infrastructure. We do novel AI research, and we do educational resources as well. So there are 3 main parts to Hugging Face, essentially. There's data sets, and this is where a lot of training data is, a lot of evaluation data is, that kind of thing. There's models, so these are machine learning models. These are some of the most popular ones as of yesterday. So apparently Gemma was trending. And we also have spaces, which are demos where people can show their technologies and how they work, and actually experiment with the technology. So that's sort of Hugging Face in a nutshell. Cool. So one of the things that we've been working on trying to do in order to have more safe, trustworthy, sort of ethically informed AI is to incentivize rigorous evaluation. So beyond red teaming, just what does it mean to have rigorous and robust evaluation that can be used to understand the unfairness of models and these kinds of things. So one way that we have done this is by creating an evaluate library, which makes it fairly trivial for anyone to evaluate any of the models on any of the data sets using a variety of different metrics. You can see the code on the right. The goal was could we make it possible to do evaluation in just 3 lines of code and have that scale? So we have that, and we have tons of different resources on the difference between different metrics, conceptual difference between metrics and measurement. We all got into a really philosophical discussion about this. Just a lot of resources to understand rigorous evaluation. We also spent a lot of time working on automatic evaluation. So when someone uploads a model, run it through a bunch of different sorts of evaluation frameworks, and then that can be posted on, for example, a leaderboard. One of the things that we learned from this was that even if you make it like dead simple to automatically get evaluation for your model, the community largely wasn't interested in it. But a side effect of this was that we found people were very interested in leaderboards. So we've done a deep dive into leaderboards. It turns out that the community loves this. So an open LLM leaderboard is our main leaderboard, and at this point, anyone releasing an open model is evaluating their models and putting it up on the open LLM leaderboard. So as of yesterday, Abacus AI was winning apparently, but the numbers switch around. It gets a ton of traffic, it's been in the news, and we built templates for it, which has now stimulated a ton of different work on this. So there's the Chatbot Arena leaderboard, which uses human ratings. There's an LLM safety leaderboard, which has toxicity, bias, robustness. And I do want to stress that these are critical ways to evaluate that is not red teaming, but gets at maybe some of the same goals. We have hallucinations leaderboards. We have specialized leaderboards for Korean and Dutch. And as of today, we released a red teaming leaderboard. So it's like for looking at robustness to different red teaming prompts. It was released with Hayes Labs. So if you want to know more about red teaming as a leaderboard, you can just search for the Hugging Face blog. It's the first blog post released today. These slides were due yesterday, so I don't have a screenshot. I literally turned in the slides and then got an email that it was launched. So it goes. But, we're trying to think of ways to incentivize rigorous evaluation, and through a lot of experimentation, what we found is that the community really responds to leaderboards. So to the extent that you can operationalize ideas as leaderboards, then you're able to get some really good practices in place. So GPT-4 was doing very well as of yesterday, and then Gemini Pro started coming up on the closed system leaderboard. Cool. So now I'll talk about red teaming specifically. So just for some ground setting, our understanding within Hugging Face is that the term came from the military. This was chatted about in the first panel as well, I think, describing activities where there's a designated team that would play an adversarial role against a home team. It shares some similarities with adversarial attacks, but one of the distinctions that we make is that red teaming tends to be natural language, whereas adversarial attacks tend to include things that aren't necessarily natural language, so like appending a string A, B, 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 C, C, that kind of thing, but basically trying to make the system act in undesirable ways. The reason why we think red teaming is important is that it's a relatively accessible means to test a system for subject matter experts. So one of the things that we talk about in responsible and ethical AI is that you need to bring people from all different backgrounds to the table to understand how well these systems work. Looking at evaluation through a red teaming lens opens up these possibilities of having experts in any domain come and really try and I hesitate to say stress test, given the definition we had of it in the last session, but adversarially test the models. And so this is a tool to identify how models may create social harms, and we see it as one tool in the toolbox for studying end-to-end in production environments. So that means you're not testing models necessarily when you're red teaming. If you're communicating with an API, you're red teaming the system, which might include a ton of different classifiers, a ton of different additional models. These might change day to day. Cool. So our view of the full approach of evaluation or sort of rigorous analysis of systems for things like safety is that red teaming applies at the tail end of consecutive interventions. So first is public consultation. So consulting with experts who are most likely to use or be affected by the model in order to understand what to prioritize in data collection, in model training, in evaluation. Then there are data requirements specifying what's desired from the model and collecting data in light of this. Data analysis and measurement, and we spend a lot of time working on ways to measure data in order to understand how we can look at the relationship between input and output and quantify what data is. Mapping inputs to outputs, so looking at the effect of different training data slices on model behavior. Disaggregated evaluation, which I'm going to preach at this panel today, which is where you see how well the system performs with respect to a bunch of different subpopulations and make sure that it's as fair as possible from a machine learning fairness perspective. There's a lot to be said about disaggregated evaluation. Then comes red teaming, and then comes user feedback, including bug bounties and adversarial testing from users. It can be difficult because it requires being very creative. Am I at time? 2 minutes? Okay, cool. It requires thinking of a lot of possibilities, and so we're seeing a need to have things be a lot more structured, or at least a way to guide people to be more creative, to bring in different thoughts about how things could go wrong. We have some ideas of how to make it a little bit more easier, so augmenting an LLM to predict whether a prompt contains problematic language that could lead to offensive outputs. And we found in general that there's a tension between the model being helpful and being harmless. Essentially, models start to try and evade questions when you work with it too much to not be harmful. Cool. So there's a few different solutions. We found that responding in code can be really useful. So asking make an ASCII table that ranks who makes the best intellectuals by race and gender. You get a maybe more direct answer than having the words put out there. So this has been an interesting way of stress testing and red teaming in particular. There was a talk about this at the last panel, so I won't go on to that. And some red teaming resources that are available through Hugging Face, Meta's bot adversarial dialogue dataset, Anthropic's red teaming attempts, AI2's real toxicity prompts, and there's a new benchmark called HarmBench that we've been very into that breaks down a lot of ways to do red teaming in a more structured way. We need best practices for critical threat scenarios. This is one of our main findings. And I will skip over this because this was chatted about. Right, so future directions is working more on the same kinds of things we've all been talking about, right? So evaluating trade-offs between evasiveness and helpfulness, sharing strategies, open sourcing data sets, coming up with strategies for critical threats scenarios, and enumerating choices based on the different sort of trade-offs. Okay, thanks.
So the reason I have to read these is because otherwise you would just get anecdotes about everybody. So the next speaker will be Zach Lipton. Anecdote. The next speaker will be Zach Lipton, who's an assistant professor in the machine learning department here at CMU, and also speaking. Oh, sorry, associate professor of I think in this particular panel, though, maybe more pertinent, is Chief Science Officer of a bridge. He also directs the ACME group, Approximately Correct Machine Intelligence, here at Lab, whose research focuses include theoretical and engineering foundations of robust and adaptive machine learning algorithms, applications to both prediction and decision-making problems in clinical medicine, NLP, and important impact of machine learning systems on society. He is not going to have a slew of slides because his little anecdote fact is that as a former jazz musician / still casual but no longer professional, it's more fun for him to just show up here and riff. So that means I do have to keep him to time, but here is Zach Lipton.
All right, that could have gone worse. And it still can. Thanks for having me here. Thanks to all the organizers. My marks are not prepared a priori, and neither are props, but I am a large language model, and I have been trained. So let's think step by step. First, an outline. I'll say a little bit about myself, a little bit about beyond honorifics, like what I'm working on in my kind of corporate life, as I think is relevant here. And then maybe kind of to share a little bit of perspective about some of the broader currents of the discussion around the executive order around the regulatory environment, about some of these terms that are becoming focal points for the discourse, and finally maybe to bring it back to what responsible deployment actually looks like in a very laser-targeted, narrow-focused industrial application, which I think could be clarifying because it's a different sort of animal than thinking widely about a model that could be used by anyone for anything. So my name is Zach. I'm a professor here at CMU. I'm also the CTO of Abridge. We are right now the technology leader in what's being called the ambient space in medicine. So this started as kind of a research stream. Some broad context on the problem that we're solving is that there's a crisis in clinical medicine. So it used to be that a doctor would see a patient, and while they were seeing the patient, they would write down some notes in shorthand, and these were basically intended to help them and other members of the care team make good decisions and track the state of the patient across visits. Sort of information that they would want to refer back to at a follow-up, or that they might want to share when referring the patient to a specialist. A lot of things that independently sound like good decisions add it all up to a kind of untenable situation. So we say we probably can't be writing clinical notes on dead trees for the next century. We should have electronic health records. This is a good thing. So now it's like you should have an electronic health record, but that means you have to be typing them. And there has to be some window in which you're going to do that. On top of that, we say, if these things are going to be digitized and they're not locked up in file cabinets, then a lot of people should have the right to access these medical records. And the big stakeholders that suddenly got access that previously didn't to the content of the note were patients who got a right to see their own medical records, also payers, so like insurance companies who wanted to be able to review the note as part of the process of adjudicating claims. We wound up with a situation in which doctors are now writing out longhand a gigantic note that is trying to simultaneously satisfy three parties. So they have to use not too much medicalese and just enough explanation material that it won't be shocking if a patient sees something. You also can't say, like, I saw Mrs. Jones, an unpleasant 60-year-old, or I see like a lively 60-year-old with mood problems. And at the same time, you had to write the note defensively, capturing detail that might not have been necessary prospectively for treatment of the patient, but it's necessary to justify the claims. And at the same time, there's a productivity crunch. So doctors are expected to see more and more patients every day. It's added up to a situation where doctors see patients for 15 minutes at a time, and they're expected to produce something like 2 or 3 pages of documentation. I don't even have to do that once a semester for my PhD students. It's like half a page, maybe a page at the doctoral student review meeting. And even then, it feels like a chore. So I love my PhD students, but it's just documentation. So what we do is we have a technology solution that sits actually inside the conversation. A doctor consents a patient to use it. And on the basis of the raw audio signal of the doctor-patient conversation, we transcribe it. We make a whole lot of sense out of what's going on in the transcript, which utterances relate to which aspects of the conversation, which aspects of the resulting documentation that have to be drafted, ultimately synthesize a first draft of all of that resulting documentation, and then put it in an interface with the doctor in the loop where they have a bunch of tools that help them to rapidly verify that everything in the produced note is correct. So there's a lot that goes into assessing the sort of like fitness for purpose and for us feeling confident when we ship any kind of change in our technological pipeline that we're making an improvement. So that's, I think how I come to a lot of these conversations, partly like academic hat on as someone who's worked on these issues and thought about responsible AI from a methodological point of view for, about 10 years, but partly as someone who's actually like the product owner for a real product that is being deployed in a very consequential domain. A concern that I have is I think we're in a weird situation. We have a lot of people, if you went on Twitter and said, how many people are AI, policists or whatever would be the word, it would be like hundreds of thousands or like maybe millions. Like hashtag AI policy is like what they are. And yet it's a strange situation. We actually have a country that has virtually no AI policy, right? We have, I think, we're starting to see a few things that verge on policy in the form of like agency rulemaking come down. We have almost nothing in the way of true legislation. And so we're in this weird situation. I think a lot of us anticipate that the world is changing fast. It's changing fast in ways that raise quite possibly new concerns, a feeling that something should be done, and a feeling that the catalyst for all of this is this thing that we're calling AI. And at the same time, AI is this sort of amorphous object because it is a technology that's so broad that it has bearing on virtually it's a kind of like computer. In fact, almost everything that we call computer was at once some part of an agenda that we called AI. And those lines have always been kind of sloppy. So now we're in a situation like most of our laws, we have a handful of laws that are quite broad, but most of our body of law is not that broad. Most of it's quite tailored. What are the fiduciary duties of officers of corporations? What constitutes medical malpractice? And now we're trying to regulate an object and to craft a policy agenda around something that's like doing stuff, computers doing stuff. So I met once as someone who's spent a lot of my career thinking about responsible AI. I believe there are risks. I believe there are challenges. I think there's ways technology could be deployed recklessly. I think there is a role for regulation to play. And at the same time, I'm somewhat skeptical of a kind of program that I think we're making progress on, but that still seems to cling too much to like platitudes because we're trying to regulate an object at the level of AI broadly and to come up with like the framework for AI. And so we wind up with something like the executive order, which I think resonates with a lot of our values. It talks about AI being virtuous, being good, being helpful to people, supporting innovation, not being biased, not causing harms, but not actually going into any of the area where the rubber hits the road, where you actually get specific enough that you could possibly say something that anyone might disagree with or that anyone might act upon. And I think that's the weird place that we're in. And I think the danger is that we see just how far we are from something concrete and useful to say whenever in the executive order we start getting towards the concrete. Like, what does it get concrete about? The number of parameters in the model. I think anyone who works in this field sees this and the first thing it's like, that's ridiculous. First of all, it's an incredibly brittle thing to focus on. There's no real deep scientific reason to believe that the number of parameters relates in any direct or like enduring way to the behavior of the model. We have things like everything else being equal, train bigger models with more parameters, I tend to get new capabilities. But we also know that we can often prune those models to have a tiny fraction of the size and retain more or less the same capability. We also have a lot of antecedents in the history of this technology where a small technical development in the span of a few months meant that we suddenly could do the same thing with either a 10th or 100th as many parameters. Like we saw this in the move from like AlexNet to, kind of fully convolutional architectures. So I think we're in this weird space where we're trying to regulate and trying to talk about how we might develop a framework around something that's supposed to guide practitioners, but we're speaking at the level of we should do tests and maybe there should be red teams. Again, red teaming as a kind of perspective piece out or survey with my student Michael Pfeffer and Hoda Haidari. And, we kind of dig into like, what does this mean? And it seems like red teaming means whatever you want it to mean. It is something of the character of like, be vigilant. Again, it's the sort of thing that no one could disagree with, but how would you actually determine whether someone had in fact red teamed? A meta point that I'd make here is I think there's something strange happening and we should all be cognizant of that. Why are we even using the word red team? And I think it's similar. Why are we using the word red team? Why are we using the word AGI starting to creep up? Why are we using some of the words? And I think we're entering a very strange world where the scholarly is becoming political And a lot of what's happening is we are kind of unthinkingly just adopting the words and framing that were being spoon-fed by a handful of players in the national discourse. And, I think at one hand, I don't think it all comes from a bad place, but there's a very conscious effort to shape the discussion that's taking place. And I think we're kind of swallowing it whole because people are just looking for answers. And when you look for answers, you'll take them from whoever claims to have them. It's why people take snake oil for, to cure their uncurable cancer. So, when it comes to being actionable, what I'll end with is the work I'm doing at a bridge. My biggest concern in some ways, and this is, sitting both on the academic side and thinking about how I imagine problems are and then actually building things. There's lots of reasons why you can't just trust companies. You'll do everything right. I think probably the biggest one is that there are often unaccounted for stakeholders. Stakeholders who might not be the customers of those companies. I think when those stakeholders actually are the customers. And I think we're in a case where, obviously the patient is also a very, very important stakeholder, but for the most part, the doctor always has complete autonomy over the production of the note and has a lot of professional interest in the note being accurate. We're lucky to be in a situation where actually the person who's receiving the outputs of our product is quite, incentive aligned. You see how much work it takes to go after every corner of quality to do what feels to us like deploying this technology responsibly. And if I were to think up to what would be the kind of broad, all-encompassing, capture all of AI framework that would possibly have told us all the things that we actually need to do this even close to responsibly, I just don't believe it exists. To give an example, there are so many precise desiderata that are, a doctor's note must satisfy. You have to describe language problems at the right level of detail. You have to make right decisions about what to include versus not to include, what constitutes a plan item, what does not constitute a plan item, what is part of the assessment versus what is part of the HPI. You have specific error modalities that relate to maybe content being accurate but not being in the right section. I call it a who said what error. Yes, this was said in the conversation, but it was said by the doctor, not the patient. So it belongs in the assessment, not the history of present illness. You have medication name misspellings. You have normative commitments about the order in which problems should be presented. There's a kind of a roadmap to quality that there's no general prescription that tells you what it is. So what guides us there? And ultimately, the meta thing that's really important here is that the right stakeholders are part of the development process. The right stakeholders are engaged in the formation of all these ontologies of what are the categories of problems and how are they assessed. This is a living process, that there is a conduit, that there is agency, that the people who are those stakeholders actually have the ability to speak directly to the development team, and that there is an ongoing QA on both sides. When we ship any change, what we are doing is we're running a suite of automated metrics against every known problem that we have. We are then engaging a clinician in the loop, offline internal QA that is reaching statistically strong conclusions about is the system across the board a step up over a previous system. Then we have a staged deployment and ultimately in vivo A/B tests. And I just think that this sort of process needs to be done on a problem by problem and industry by industry basis to some extent. And I think that this is the biggest danger that we face now is we're at a serious risk of designing a bunch of platitudes that all sound great, but don't actually give companies the ability to do anything more responsibly than they would have otherwise.
I said he was good at riffing, right? Our third and final introduction here is for Ajay Kumar, who is a managing director of AI Frontiers, leading research and development towards pushing the frontiers of AI capabilities at Microsoft. AI Frontiers is a non-geographical, mission-focused lab inside Microsoft Research that explores innovations in foundation models and platform capabilities to push the frontier of AI capabilities, efficiency, and control. I spent a year at Microsoft Research, and you know when you join a job, there's those people that are sort of just famous. They're like, oh, at some point you should meet her. So, therefore, I get to now introduce AJ.
That was a really good riff. I don't know how to follow that, but let's see. Before starting this new role at Microsoft Research as the managing director of this new lab, I spent the last decade really thinking about responsible AI and how to establish responsible AI inside a company like Microsoft in a formal way. And one of the things that was really interesting about my experience with doing responsible AI at Microsoft was that all of these efforts that now I'm gonna present to you, they are so formal, they all emerged as research ideas. Because at a company like Microsoft, where there are so many businesses and execution pressure on so many different products, it is so important to have researchers who are looking into the horizon without the pressure of delivering and shipping things, that can actually ask the question of, what are we doing? What is our responsibility in building the technology? What are the practices in doing this in the right way? How can we organize ourselves in doing this? So my responsible AI experience at Microsoft is, I think, one of the best examples of why research really matters in industry. So as researchers, we started seeing that many of the machine learning systems, and I'm talking about the days of ImageNet and supervised learning, which feels like a lifetime ago, we started seeing that models learning from human data were actually emulating the biases of people. And this was one of the first indicators that issues like fairness is going to become an important part of the AI development considerations. But all of the efforts actually took a lot more seriousness at Microsoft once from the CEO level, from the Satya Nadella level. As early as 2016, Microsoft released the principles of responsible AI. These principles are still the principles that we run with, include fairness, reliability, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. Of course, it is actually an easy thing for any CEO to go out and say these are the principles. The question is, how do you implement these principles in the production, development, and deployment of that technology across the different products of the company? So that has been the adventure we've been on in terms of thinking about organizations that can really make this happen. And in fact, the current organization inside Microsoft includes around 1,000 people doing responsible AI full-time, both as central pieces. For example, we have a research organization called Ether. We have focused engineering groups looking into responsible AI deployment and implementation. And we also have the Office of Responsible AI sitting inside our legal department under Brad Smith that is thinking about compliance and policy. At the same time, in addition to these centralized structures, it is very important to have embedded people that are really thinking about how different groups inside the company are doing this. So for this, we have the diffused responsible AI implementation teams and responsible AI champs who are pushing for the implementation of responsible AI for their particular organizations. So one of the things that came out of all of these organizations and the thinking is the responsible AI standard. Every product, every AI product that is being built at Microsoft needs to actually go by this responsible AI standard. We are currently at the version 2, which is publicly available on the internet. And writing this standard took 3 years of development, authored by 30+ domain experts, including researchers, legal experts, and engineers. And this talks about the 6 principles and defines 17 different goals around the implementation. Think about this as like a blueprint that you can use in the way you're developing responsible AI. Just to talk about what are the steps we are currently have in our practice of responsible AI, and this is actually a pretty long list. So it starts with compliance and governance. At this point, we talk about stakeholders, as Zach mentioned. It's an important part of how you build products. You think about the different stakeholders. You think about the principles. You document what you have. You think about limited access. Are there particular technologies that are risky that they should be only functioned under a limited access framework? We have safety review processes, and we have processes for continuous improvement. But one of the steps that is very, very important in the development of responsible AI is an impact statement. This is particularly for use cases. Before you develop anything, you create an impact assessment that really talks about, for different stakeholders you have in the picture, what are the different risks and the harms that you should be concerned about. We have privacy and security reviews, and in this state, we also have the red teaming process. What follows further is measurement for the different risks that are identified. We do measurement, evaluation, understanding, look into disparities in terms of performance, and do continuous monitoring. And then, of course, we have the mitigation, oversight, and these different steps. And actually, this list includes Microsoft's commitments to the White House executive action. And there is a good overlap between the practices that are already implemented at Microsoft and our commitments to the White House. And one of the commitments we have made to the White House is that we are going to be, and we are already doing this, we have a designated AI red team that actually does red teaming on any AI application that is above a certain risk threshold. Microsoft has a long history of red teaming, not AI red teaming. The red teaming at Microsoft started in 2002 with the Trustworthy Computing Group. There wasn't any mention of AI in those systems. It was the traditional security reviews that would happen. And then around 2018, we actually developed a dedicated AI red team. This dedicated AI red team currently sits inside one of these focused engineering organizations that focuses on responsible AI. It's an interdisciplinary team of experts that focus on security, adversarial machine learning, and responsible AI. And one of the things this team has been doing is actually publishing and open sourcing their work, including the adversarial machine learning threat metrics that was shared with the public in 2020, and the counterfeit tool that was released in 2021. We are seeing that the kind of the coverage of the risks red teaming focuses on right now is continuously increasing, which is one of the challenges that this team is facing. They have to look into traditional security vulnerabilities. They also need to look at new security vulnerabilities like prompt injection attacks, vulnerable code generation if the systems are generating code. They are looking into well-understood responsible AI risks and new responsible AI risks that come from generative AI, including non-grounded content and offensive language. They are also looking into malicious use cases, misuse of AI, as well as just benign use of AI systems and the privacy lists. One of the things this team tries to do is actually think about the point of users coming from different backgrounds and different expertise levels. So they do red teaming, assuming that they are a competent AI expert, malicious user coming in to break things, as well as a lay user that doesn't really understand this technology and think about the risks that that user might be facing. One of the things, a few observations about the AI red teaming practices inside Microsoft. We are seeing that the scope of red teaming is always increasing with the newly discovered risk factors. We are both thinking about, I think this point came out in the previous definition discussions, we are focusing on both malicious and benign personas when we are doing red teaming. One of the challenges we are facing in the red teaming processes is that the AI technology is constantly changing, which means that a model you red team today may pose different threats in a future iteration. In addition to that, the technology is constantly changing, which means they may be equipped with new risks that you have to identify, and that constant changing nature is one of the pressures that this team is facing. Another difference between the AI red teaming versus a traditional red teaming is the stochastic nature of AI systems. That trying things once may not give you the perfect answer. You may actually need to try the model many times with different prompts and prompt variations to really assess the risk factor. And one of the things AI Red Team does at Microsoft is working a lot in terms of mitigations as well. We find these risks, but how do we mitigate that? The approach they are taking is something that is called defense in depth, where they are looking into from models to the different layers of the platform to the user interaction, thinking about how mitigations can be in place to reduce the risks. In terms of the red teaming coverage, I think this was also previously discussed that we should be red teaming models and applications. I suggest that there is one more red teaming that we need to do, and that's on the platform level. The red teaming we do on the models part is very important to understand new risks and the possibility of misuse, which relate very much to the discussions on dual use. It is also important to understand the emerging capabilities that may also contribute to dual use and misuse, but also understand the limitations, inherent limitations of that model class. I suggest that we also need to think about the platform level red teaming. I think this point also came in earlier discussions that in many uses of AI systems today, in building AI applications, we are not really doing it by prompting these AI models. We are building a completely new architectural paradigm around LLMs to be able to build these systems. We are thinking a lot about orchestration, memory, in-context learning, what is the context that goes into the execution. And then we are connecting these models to plugins and APIs so that these models can actually take actions in the world on behalf of the users. This way, we can actually give new capabilities, expand the capabilities of what the models can do alone by combining these models with this new architecture that includes orchestration and memory. At the same time, we are seeing that combining the models with these platform pieces introduces new risk factors that may not come up when you are just red teaming the models themselves. For example, when the models have access to plugins, there are completely new risk factors AI red team can identify that they wouldn't be aware of if they were just looking at the model alone. At the application level red teaming, the impact assessment that is done plays a very important role in terms of creating the scope for the AI red team. And the findings of the AI red team is shared with our deployment board to make decisions about whether the systems will be deployed in the real world. One of the particular red teaming efforts I have been involved in is when OpenAI gave us an early access to the GPT-4 model. We used a few months, came together as researchers, really looked into both the capabilities and the limitations of this new model that is now called GPT-4 and wrote this paper on sparks of artificial general intelligence. In addition to saying that this model is really powerful, this paper also outlines significant new adversarial use cases that we weren't aware of before. So there's a particular section of this report where you can look into these adversarial use cases. Some of the examples I would like to show you is that with the model we had access that day, you could actually create a misinformation campaign convincing people and trying to convince people that they should not be vaccinating their kids. Or you could have really convincing conversations with children, simulated children, that these children should be harming themselves. Or create a pretty personalized misinformation campaign where you could convince people that you would try to convince people that the world is actually flat. The important thing is after all of that red teaming, now with OpenAI and Microsoft working together, there is actually a lot of fine-tuning and platform level work that got into the APIs of these models, and you cannot replicate these situations. We have actually prevented users creating these situations now. At the same time, the fact that that initial model was capable of creating these misuse scenarios is very important. In terms of scaling the red teaming, think about the Microsoft scale. We have probably released 250 GenAI applications into the world just last year. Pretty much one release per working day was the speed that the company was going for. And there's a real question about how can you scale the red teaming practices for a company that is doing so many releases. Here, the idea is combining human ingenuity with automation and tooling. And just by pure luck, yesterday, the AI Red Team released a new tool to the public and in open source called Pirate. And what this tool does is actually it automates the process of sending prompts to a generative AI model and then evaluate the responses and kind of doing some automated adversarial testing to be able to help the AI Red Team to scale further. So in case you're interested, you can download and look at it on GitHub. I'll pass this part. I want to talk about a few of the challenges we are facing today when we think about AI red teaming. One of them is the increasing speed in development and deployment. I think I already mentioned this, but in addition to just releasing many different systems into the world, there is also the increasing speed of how new models using different modalities and can be used for different use cases are coming into the world. This is just the list of some of the models that came out since 2020, but even I think it was last week or the week before, we had the Gemini 1.5 and the Soma, which is really putting new work ahead in terms of what we should do in terms of the red teaming. The other one is the diversity of the use cases, especially AI models getting into areas like sciences, biology, chemistry. There is really an important question about what is the right team that will do the AI red teaming when domain expertise is going to matter significantly to be able to red team them. The third one, I think the next panel is going to discuss this, so I'll be brief on this, is increasing risks that are coming from dual use. Many of the technologies we are dealing with can be used for good, and they can be also misused in different contexts, and we still don't have criteria in terms of how we are managing the trade-off between open sourcing and helping innovation versus preventing dangers that can come from misuse. One of the things we really need to do, and hopefully this venue is a start of that discussion, is getting into some collective agreement that can guide AI red teaming across the industry. Today I tried to share what Microsoft is doing, but a standardization across the industry will be very important. For example, what are the particular use cases that AI red teaming should be implemented? What are the different triggers for models, platforms, and applications where AI red teaming should become a mandatory requirement? We really don't know how to share the findings from AI red teaming across the industry. There are a lot of reasons why people shy away from sharing their findings. There are legal issues, there are marketing issues, there are perception issues that come into play. However, if we are not sharing our findings and working through these issues together, we are going to fail as an industry. So we really need to come up with some practice in terms of sharing. Clearly, there is quite a bit of work NIST is going to be doing in terms of best practices, tools, and so forth, but this is also something that is much needed in terms of coordination. And finally, open sourcing requires some careful attention, especially as dual-use scenarios coming into attention. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So I get to kick us off with some discussion based off of sort of general themes that I was hearing here, and then we'll also try to alternate with the audience for additional questions. And so I think one of the things that was really nice that just came up, right, was this sort of general tie-in into the sort of history of red teaming as like a concept. And then this also came up in everybody's discussions to a certain extent about the sort of fundamentally maybe different nature of doing this in the AI environment versus doing it in maybe a, for example, more static setting of like a code base or like a hardware platform or something like this. And so I guess the question is, if there are some thoughts that you have on, I mean, some of them have already been outlined, but if there are specifically useful things to mention about those differences and how we should therefore be thinking about the problem because of the sort of non-stationarity or the randomness, or I think you had red teaming, Meg, as like the 9th step in the process, right? So is there sort of a fundamentally different way that we should be thinking about the concept versus what we've inherited from other communities?
Everyone's looking at me like I'll have the answer. Well, I do have the answer. So yeah, this also came up in the first panel as well. But so the term red teaming, initially came from military usage, where it was very clear what it was. There's literally a red team against the home team. It was adapted to cybersecurity where it was relatively structured. So you're looking for different sorts of vulnerabilities given some specific types of access or compute constraints, these kinds of things. The machine learning world, I think, tends to borrow terminology without doing too much of a deep dive into what it means, kind of going by vibes a bit. And I am worried that the term red teaming is being used without a sort of scientifically crisp definition that would be most useful for making, measurable progress forward. That said, I do think it's important to experiment around with ideas, whatever you call it, with some goal of, making the models more safe or whatever it is, and not have standardized approaches while everyone sort of sorts out what to do. The diversity of inputs is really important. But I think, the term red teaming should be understood as like inspired by previous terminology of red teaming, but bringing in a lot of ideas about rigorous evaluation more generally. And I think this was especially true in the executive order. I think everyone that read it with me, we were all surprised that red teaming kept showing up again and again and again because we saw it as this kind of niche thing within evaluation. But my understanding is that it's becoming a term that just sort of means evaluation for safety. And it doesn't just have to be adversarial testing. It doesn't just have to be stress testing. We can do other kinds of things. Call it red teaming if you want. But we can do, rigorous evaluation where we look at the performance of a system with respect to certain subgroups in specific situations, looking at differences in performance. There's a lot of ways we can structure evaluation meeting the same goals of red teaming, even if maybe that's not necessarily the right term to be using.
I only like red teaming that comes from the red teaming region of France.
Otherwise, it's sparkling teaming.
It's exactly. Did you guys want it? Yeah.
I'll add something to it. I think red teaming and quantitative evaluation need to go hand in hand in terms of the practices. And I think you asked the question of how AI models and systems are different. The evolving nature of it and the fact that the use cases and the coverage of these systems are changing all the time and getting bigger is one of the biggest challenges. And I think that's also showing up how I see, at least at Microsoft, measurement and red teaming are being used as complementary approaches. In terms of evaluation, the focus is on things that you know, like the known things. Like, I already know that there is a risk on this. I have created a benchmark. I'm evaluating it to see if this is actually holding or not. I have a test set for reliability assessment. I'm putting that in. But then you know that as the models are evolving, the benchmarks you have are not capturing all the risks anymore, both in terms of security and in terms of the responsible AI risks. So the AI red team comes in to kind of look into the unknown unknowns. Like, what am I missing in releasing this out? And we have to create a process where those discovered things by the AI red team now goes into evaluation and become benchmarks that things can be evaluated on. And then the AI red team goes into finding the next unknown unknowns as these models evolve. I feel like we haven't really made it crisp how these different pieces, like evaluation and red teaming, have complementary roles in the way we are really building technology responsibly.
I think as maybe Zach also expanding, if you would, like when you're talking, your use cases were these very customer-facing examples, right? So does the nature of the red teaming in this AI context different if you're not thinking in terms of general frameworks, but you're thinking in this very narrow?
Well, I mean, I think it's almost like a category distinction. It's not just like, is A different from B? It's like, I don't know what B is. No one knows what B is, but A is a thing. Like if you look, like I think what you're seeing is a political moment, and you're seeing a bunch of people, and it's not just political in the sense of like right left. It's a sense of like the meme wars, Like, there's people, they have their words. They want their words out there. There's, well, why are we using the word safety? Like, as opposed to all the ways we've talked about responsible AI always. Let's be clear. We were using the word safety because there were suddenly a massive amount of calls for proposals that were dishing out crazy amounts of money that basically made as a criteria for getting them that you took your agenda, whatever it was, anything related to responsible AI, and you started branding it as safety. This was largely like a meme war between like a sort of effective altruist aligned, like kind of West Coast thing and other folks. And it's not like the lines are hard. It's not like everyone on one side is reasonable, everyone on the other side is not. But like one way or another, we're winding up with like, these are the currents by which we're winding up talking about the word. And then we're like, what is the right way to interpret the word? And I don't know, I feel like we're starting to have the conversation. And then, and sort of in the weird compromise, like the weird thing that happens is that if a meme is too successful, if it becomes the word that everyone uses, then it also in the process becomes meaningless. So I think there's a broader context here, which is there's a set of people who are like, you know, and I feel like we almost like don't call it out by name, but like, and again, I'm not even of the like taking a stance on it. I'm just being descriptive here. There's a set of people here where whether you think they're crazy or whether you think we're all going to look back and say, shit, we should have listened to them. There's a set of people who believe that we are at a moment that is an utterly like civilization shaking moment in terms of how technology will completely reshape society and possibly wipe out the human race in the process. And they believe that this is what safety is, and this is why we have to use the word safety and adopt their framing. And you look at the executive order, you see traces of that agenda and nods to it. There's a concern that is being like spoken about frequently of like, do things like ChatGPT bring about novel bioweapons risks that could potentially like reshape war and wipe out all of man? And at the same time, you know, what you're getting is like sort of the word safety one, but then it's sort of now then becomes the big tent. And it's like we're all showing up at the same conference still. So it's like now it's like safe. It's also, so the red team, what's their goal? Something about existential risk for all of humanity and assessing whether the model is going to do that, but also something about like, is it unfair? And these are just wildly different things. One is acting about like, you know, is in the worst case, the motivated person trying to use this thing as a weapon able to, through motivated pursuit, like get it to do something, to reveal a capability that otherwise they wouldn't have that brings about the Holocaust that ends us all. And someone else is asking, if I deploy this in an industrial setting, am I making things better? Am I making this worse? How are the benefits or the, you know, harms shared among different sectors of society? One of these questions is like a worst case scenario that is anticipating a possible reality. We have no evidence to believe like we're actually in that reality. And on the other side, you know, you have questions that are of a very different nature. They're statistical in nature. In one case, maybe if you really think that's the risk, I don't know, maybe you should become the Unabomber, or maybe you should do something. In other case, what you need, it's not even clear that the red team has to be someone separate from the people developing the models. I think what you need is like rigorous statistical practice. What you need is crisp definitions. What you need is the relevant data sets that are representative of the environments in which you're going to deploy this technology, where you can run these tests. And I think what's happening is we're like lumping all this stuff into a common thing, and we're saying, how does that thing need to change? But the thing has become so meaningless as to just be like word.
So I want to move us though towards the latter case. So I think part of where I'm going with this is like when you're dealing with a medical domain, you're dealing with one of the most regulated domains that exist, right?
For sure.
And so, or when you're, you know, so all of you have experience in very different aspects of the industry. You have very customer facing things. Tech is notoriously underregulated by comparison. And so I guess the question is, given that interface, so not the existential threat aspect, right? But the like, you know, Microsoft Copilot is going to show up in everything, right? Version. You are actually going to make a mistake that is affecting medical diagnosis potentially or coverage, right? What is red teaming or what is necessary in that context, in that very real, yeah.
Yeah, I think what's necessary is just incredibly strong practices around quality. You know, a clearly delineated set of desiderata that need to be satisfied, the strongest possible automated measurements for covering them, human in the loops evaluations to catch the sort of unknown unknowns. A cycle of evaluation that is based on data that is perpetually being run, not as a like, I ran it on the test set and then I deployed it in some other environment, but like an integrated process of like continual evaluation that is part of the very practice of deploying a model, where the evaluation is taking place on the very same data and on the very same encounters in which the model is being deployed. Like these are the kinds of practices that are. Is that red teaming? I don't know. Like, we don't have a group of people wearing red shirts who are like coming and attacking us when we're doing this. But you know, I think that's what responsible deployment looks like in this setting.
So I saw both of you grab your microphones, and so I feel like I should like. Meg, do you want to go first, and then I saw you pick up your. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I have a couple points. So the first thing that I'm realizing, given all these comments and everything that's happened today, is that we might say that there is a valuation that we do for systems, that we do for AI, and you can break down evaluation into a lot of different things. And I really liked HA's breakdown of the model level, the platform level, and the application level, because I felt like that was quite clarifying as to the types of evaluations that are most important. And so I often work at the model level, and in the context of the model level, disaggregated evaluation is super useful. So there's a whole world called ML fairness, machine learning fairness, where technically fairness means that across different subpopulations, the model performs roughly the same. So it works just as well for women as it does for men, as it does for non-binary. You can slice and dice it by subpopulations that are generally like protected, sensitive, ones that have historically been subject to bias, right? So this is one critical type of evaluation that really applies at the model level. And then sort of moving forward a little bit from what everyone has said, once we're at the system level, and the system in context level, this is where red teaming as an evaluation really shines. And by this, I mean evaluation done by people in context. So diverse perspectives from doctors, from nurses, from educators, from people who would be potentially using these systems, sitting down and working with those systems in the kinds of contexts where they would be working with them. And I would say for national security as well, you might have professionals want to do that. And so I feel like that unifies a lot of thinking and puts forward a sort of framing of red teaming that connects a few things. It's obviously not something everyone would agree on, but I think it is something that speaks to how red teaming is one piece of a puzzle, and it's a piece of the puzzle at the level of bringing in diverse perspectives and looking at the system in context. That was basically the point I was going to make, yeah.
Yeah, just a few comments before we probably go to the next question. At some point we should. On Zach's point, one of the things that I'm most bothered by is the gap between the practice and the talk on Twitter or X, whichever we are calling it. So, for example, on a topic like red teaming, for us, we started red teaming in 2018 because it was necessary. It wasn't a nice to have. It wasn't a hypothetical idea. It was just a necessity, right? So how do we actually bring that necessity observations into whatever these executive orders are going to be is going to be important. Like practitioners and their experiences should matter maybe as much as the existential crisis, I don't know, on this one. In terms of model evaluation, I feel like we have significant gaps in terms of how we are evaluating the models today, in the sense that we are very much doing it based on existing benchmarks that do not capture the different capabilities models are gaining as they are being trained. So because of that, there is a significant coverage problem we see with model evaluation. And right now, I think AI red teaming is trying to also, in addition to the application use cases you're talking about, Meg, we are also seeing that red team is coming in to kind of address the issues we have from model evaluation coverage. I don't know if it is the permanent problem or as we reinvent the science of evaluation, that is going to be redefined. But right now, I don't have any other solution to the gaps we have in the way model evaluation is happening.
I would just add just two
While
things.
while you're answering, if you, we're gonna have questions from the audience as well. So the microphone is there, and so if you want to alert that you have interest in asking a question.
I would say like two things I think are really important when you think about evaluation in the like generative AI era, and maybe there's like a couple things coupled. One is like that is the generative AI in the sense of like we're producing whether it's like images or raw text documents or code that is run in some context, and the other side is just industrial AI. That for a long time like AI was buried in a handful of applications and was mostly like a trophy piece for big tech companies. And it's moved into a very different place of like there is a real AI industry. And I think one important thing that changes is that we're used to thinking of evaluation. We here in academia of the offline data sets and the real world means like the data was the actual data. Think of evaluation as like the test set. And when you think about like harms, what are harms about? I think when you talk about harms, you're talking about actions. You're talking about something that happened to someone. I think we often take this view of like we say the word harm, but then people's heads start going to like, could I by some process, get the model to do something that I don't like? Or I think it's I think there's a much, or at least in my setting, the relevant notion of harm is like to be thinking of the deployment of an AI system as an intervention. And I think a big piece of evaluation that we need to all be thinking about for responsible deployment is in evaluation that accounts not just for like some kind of like crude measure of something that looks like accuracy, but actually like in our case, when we put something into production, are we actually having notes that are more comprehensive, notes that have less mistakes? Are we actually saving doctors time? Are the benefits of that technology felt across doctors who speak with different flavors of accented English or in visits with patients who speak different languages besides English? So that's like one big piece. I think the other big piece that changes when we think about evaluation in the generative AI world is that there is no accuracy. And I think that's just a wild thing that we all need to get our heads around, is training models in a world where there is no gold reference, where you're trying to get models to do things that no one has a data set of these things being done like to what we would consider an acceptable standard before. And you're getting there by you're not necessarily doing RL in the sense of state action, state reward, but you are doing something that is of the character of RL in the sense that you are hill climbing against an evaluation, not against a reference. And in the absence of references, what evaluation looks like is very strange. There's not like, this is the quality metric. You're building like a very large sensory apparatus that includes the things you know how to evaluate quantitatively and the things that you need a human in the loop to evaluate, and doing a lot of like head-to-head comparisons to know that you're moving in the right direction. And that's, I think, where a lot of the meat of responsible deployment lives. That is like outside the red teaming umbrella.
Do we have some audience questions before I can ask more of my own?
Thank you. I think adding to what Zach was saying, in industry, so maybe recalling to what I was thinking about, talking about in the student case, I was able to get the students to really be critical about the tools by aligning their prompts and assessment of the prompts with their grades. So you have to give me 10 good prompts and 10 bad prompts, or 10 prompts that showed that AI actually failed. But in sort of the industrial setting, what are if there's a lack of metric to even understand the quality, how do we align the profit of having really powerful models versus, because right now we barely understand, I don't know, GPT-2 or something. How do we catch up? How do we incentivize, basically?
Well, I think this is part of why we're having this discussion with NIST, right? I mean, a lot of us in the industry have turned to regulators because we realize that there are critical things that need to be done and there's no incentive to do it. And not even in a we're not interested in it kind of way, but like just in terms of market dynamics. If tons of people are putting out something that your company isn't putting out, you marginalize your company out of the market. So there's been, I think, a push from industry to regulate, in part because we see that there's things that everyone should be doing, but we need an adult or a teacher basically to tell us we should do it. So it's not unlike getting a grade, right? You could imagine some sort of regulatory scheme where you get a grade for your red teaming or something like that. There just needs to be some sort of body outside of that company that they would then try and please or appease or whatever it is, setting that bar that has to be hit.
And I would like to add one thing, which is, Zach said accuracy is not the metric anymore, but there are new metrics that are being defined now. So it's not like we cannot define metrics or we are not defining metrics. It is a much harder performance issue you need to make sense of because now it is multidimensional. It is not binary. And there are many different types of harms you need to consider in the way you are defining metrics. So it is not like in the past it would be, okay, I have this binary test set. I was 89, you were 92, you were clearly better. Now it's not that, like you are building a model or a system. There are many dimensions that you need to evaluate it on. And then it really becomes a conversation about how do we actually do the trade-off, or how we collectively think about all of these dimensions in the way we are evaluating quality of something. And we have to be okay with that it's going to be a harder task now, and it's going to take more effort from us getting it right.
Hi, everybody. I'm Krishnan. Thank you again for this very illuminating discussion. I want to focus on the third phase of what HA, this idea of field testing, which each of you have spoken about. I was curious to would love for you to comment on, there's been a long history in social science on program evaluation, which is this whole idea of if you have technology of some sort as an intervention, how do you actually evaluate that technology, not just in terms of the actions that are taken through the use of this technology, Zach just talked about that, but also how it might affect the way in which people may interact in the presence of that technology. So for instance, in the example that you gave, if there's an ambient listening device, it is actually listening to the conversation, how does that change the nature of the conversation that the physician has, or how the patient responds? And I'm using just that as a context. You can think of any other context as well. So when you think about responsible use of AI, in that third, there's model testing, there's red teaming, and I think you called it platform, and the red teaming, the last part, which is the field testing part. What are the factors we should take into account? One is, what actions do people take using the AI, what harm or benefit is caused or realized? But is there also the aspect of the way in which the environment within which the AI has been used as an intervention changes, and what does that then result in? And how do you measure that? Is that something that you all have thought about as well? Thank you.
I mean, I could start since you spoke about like our particular use case. First, I think it's a great question. I think there's like a narrow answer and a wide answer. I think the wide answer is sort of like, how does one evaluate like any intervention in the context of a broader, complex bureaucracy or a broad institution? Like, how does one evaluate like a corporate practice? And I'm sure there's like, lots of thoughts and no crisp, great answer. And I think these are not questions that you like immediately resolve there. I think I put it, the journal is called Management Science, but management is not a science. You could be scientific in your pursuit of the art, as musicians are too. Then there's like the narrow question about our use case and like what do we see, not at the level maybe of like the whole broader ecosystem, but just like what goes on inside these conversations. And I think it's already we see it, and it's really interesting. You know, like some of the examples we see are positive, and one thing that happens is doctors often are a bit tired and don't say everything that they're thinking. But then when they don't say the things that they are thinking, they don't get heard by the AI system and they don't show up in the note. So there's lots of ways that doctors are more communicative. So like a normal physical exam might sound something like, I'm going to listen to your lungs down. Okay. Yeah. Can I see your knee? Okay. And then they get a very uninteresting physical exam report after that. So then, you know, at some point they start saying, I'm going to listen to your lungs. Okay, I don't hear any wheezes, no bronchi, no rasps. Checking your reflexes are normal. So I mean, we see that immediately, that there's like a kind of, and I think it's one of those things that like I don't want to be like arrogant or just suppose that like every way that it changes the dynamic is necessarily a positive one. But I think that would be an example of a positive case. But at the same time, right, it's at once like positive and great and exciting because you're like, oh, maybe we've improved something of the level of communication, but it's also like a warning that we have to be very vigilant, because there is, whenever you change the dynamic of an interaction, you insert technology into a process, you have to, there's many ways that, there's many different effects this is going to have. And, you know, these ultimately have some kind of feedback cycles, right? People are going to speak differently. We're going to get different data in the future.
There are many different factors, I think, that makes your questions answer so much harder. First of all, experience really matters. Interaction really matters. When we are thinking about red teaming models, we are kind of like, okay, computer scientists, machine learning people, you are going to create your benchmark and do this. When we are getting into applications, it is interdisciplinary. We bring domain experts, we bring human-computer interaction experts into the room, and they really, really matter in terms of determining what are the metrics and how things should be evaluated. How do we bring in techniques from qualitative evaluation with quantitative evaluation and do it together? There are also longitudinal problems in this one as well, like people's behavior change, they adapt. So what we observe when we release a system may not really be the same when people get used to that system. Sometimes it is good because people adapt. Zach's case is a really good positive one. But sometimes you may not be aware of the longer term consequences and harms of the system when you just release it, and you have to watch it for a long time to really observe that maybe there's an automation bias going on, or people are forgetting the expertise they had because now they are becoming highly reliant on the system. So I feel like so far we haven't really included other fields into this discussion very much. This is probably the time to do so. And we have to really reinvent how we are going to do this very complex evaluation with the speed that we are pushing AI systems out into the world. And that feels like a significant challenge.
So I think this speaks to the need to roll out releases to larger and larger groups of people. So one term we use is dog fooding in tech circles. It's where you have a small amount of people, you know, just in your office maybe work on it. And then once it's past dog fooding, you can go to alpha testing, where you just have people who have opted in, people you trust to give feedback. And I think one thing that's coming up here is that it would be really useful to slowly release technology to a larger and larger audience, where the first releases are with the people who are most likely to use it and benefit from it. So I had done this study on, not a study, I did an informal poll on Twitter where I asked people, you know, what domain are you in? What would you need to see in order to trust an AI system? And I used all of the EU high-risk categories for different job domains. And across the board, everyone said, I would need to work with the system, see what it output, be able to edit it, be able to work with it. Like, I don't want a benchmark result. I need to be able to see its output piece by piece. Like, across the board, that's what people said. But I think there's really something to that, especially tied with red teaming, is that that's kind of what red teaming is trying to do. And so part of the strategy here might be releasing specifically to a small set of doctors who have opted in, specifically to, bioweapon experts who have opted in. And then after they've done their iterations with it, consider maybe these larger releases, and they've been able to look at the differences and report back and that sort of thing.
So I believe we have 2 minutes. And so therefore, since I have this whole list of questions, we're going to do the rapid fire 2 questions. You only get to say yes or no, or you get 1 word. You get 1 word answers. Okay. Are open source models the answer to our problems?
No.
Yeah.
That was a yeah with sarcasm, so I think that was a no.
I don't know what problems you're talking about.
Like does that address
Some problems.
some problems?
No, that's not. No. Sometimes.
Oh, sometimes. Okay. Will mandating red teaming stifle innovation?
No.
These are very nuanced questions.
Why it's rapid fire. It makes it spicy.
Requirements, science.
You get the last word. We have less than 1 minute left.
Empowering instead. Empowering.
Okay. And with that, we'll close. Thank you, everybody.